The man behind the counter weighed my wedding ring like it was nothing more than gold, because that's exactly what it was to him. 40 years, and it came down to just a number on a little digital scale. I thought I'd cry. I didn't. I signed the paper, took the cash, and drove straight to the travel agency before I could talk myself out of it. One-way ticket to Cebu. Everything I had left that wasn't already spoken for by my husband's secrets. My son doesn't know yet. I keep waiting to feel like I lost something. I'm still waiting. Before I go any further, if you've found your way to this channel, I'd love it if you'd subscribe. There are a lot of us out here starting over later than anyone expected to, and I like knowing you're listening. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit of mine, starting in the middle and letting you catch up. So let me back up to where this actually began, which wasn't the pawn shop. It was 14 months earlier, standing in a funeral home in Peoria, Illinois, picking out a casket for a man I'd stopped being married to, in every way that mattered, a long time before he died. Donald Harvison wasn't a cruel man. I want to be accurate about that, because it would be easier if he were. He was reliable in the way a filing cabinet is reliable. He kept receipts for everything, labelled folders in a filing cabinet in the basement that I wasn't, strictly speaking, forbidden from opening, but that I somehow never did, the way you avoid a room in your own house without ever deciding to. He paid the bills, he mowed the lawn, he showed up to things. He came to every one of Craig's Little League games and never once missed a parent-teacher conference. And I want that on the record, because it would be too easy to make him sound like a man who neglected us. He didn't neglect us. He simply never once asked what I wanted, and I never once, for 38 years, worked up the nerve to volunteer it. He also decided, without asking, what car we'd buy, which church we'd attend, whether I'd take that promotion at the hospital. No, he said, someone needs to be home for the kids, and I was 34 and I believed him. 38 years of that. Not screaming, not black eyes. Just a slow erasure, one small decision at a time, until I looked up one day and realized I hadn't picked anything for myself since Nixon was president. I'm exaggerating. Ford, maybe. I've never been entirely sure why that detail sticks with me more than the bigger ones. The house, the car, the promotion I didn't take. Except that it's small enough to hold in one hand, the way a single missing button tells you more about a coat's neglect than a torn seam ever could. After he died, I kept setting 2 coffee cups some mornings. I'd catch myself halfway through pouring and just stand there at the counter, holding the pot, feeling foolish. I drove past the hospital where I'd worked billing for 31 years, even though there was no reason to go that way anymore. I watched television without following it. The house felt like a museum nobody visited. I kept his recliner exactly where it had always sat, angled toward the television, even though I'd started watching from the couch instead, as if the chair itself still had an opinion about who was allowed to use it. Some evenings I'd catch myself explaining things out loud to an empty room. What I'd bought at the store, why I'd changed the thermostat. The way you narrate your day to someone who used to grunt back at you from behind a newspaper. I didn't tell anyone I did that. I'm only telling you now because it seems like the kind of thing that matters more than it sounds like it should. Then the letters started coming. I didn't recognize the return addresses at first, and I nearly threw the second one away with the coupons and catalogue mailers. The way you learn to filter out anything that doesn't look urgent when you've spent 3 decades doing the same thing professionally for other people's medical bills. Not from anyone I knew, from a collections office. Then another. My son Craig came over to help me sort through the estate. He's an insurance adjuster, good with numbers, and I was grateful at first. And that's how we found out Don had run up almost $60,000 on 3 credit cards I'd never seen. I remember the exact moment the number appeared on Craig's laptop screen, and how strange it was to feel my stomach drop for a marriage already ended, over a debt no one could argue with the man who'd created it. Not another woman. Nothing that dramatic. Video poker, mostly, at the casino boat 40 minutes from the house, going back at least 6 years. He'd been quietly bleeding us dry while telling me we needed to watch our spending, while I clipped coupons like it mattered. I remember sitting at the dining room table with Craig, watching him lay the statements out in neat rows the way he must lay out claim documents for a living, and thinking that I recognized my own handwriting on the household budget notebook right next to numbers I'd never seen in my life. He kept saying, "Mum, did you know about this?" in a voice that got quieter each time, until I finally told him the truth, which was that I hadn't known about any of it, that I'd trusted a man to handle the money because that had always been the arrangement. Long before either of us thought to question whether it was a fair one. Craig didn't push further that afternoon. He just sat with me at the table for a long while afterward, not saying much, And I remember being grateful for that silence in a way I couldn't have explained to him even if he'd asked. We had to sell the house to cover it. I remember standing in the empty living room the last morning, after the movers had come for what little I was keeping, and feeling the particular hollowness of a room that no longer has anything in it to absorb sound. My own footsteps echoing back at me in a way they never had in 38 years of living there. I want to be precise, not lose the house. Sell it in an organized way, which is its own kind of grief, watching strangers walk through your kitchen asking about square footage. Craig meant well. I need to say that clearly, because I'm about to be hard on him. He started managing my accounts online, just until things settle, he said, and I let him, because I was tired and because some old part of me still thought that's what you do. You let the capable person take the wheel. He began forwarding me brochures for assisted living communities, Sunset Meadows, The Willows, places with names like they were trying to convince you it was still spring. I looked at exactly one of them, a glossy trifold with a photograph of two silver-haired strangers laughing over a game of cards, and felt something in my chest go tight and defensive, the way you feel when someone hands you a script for the rest of your life and expects you to read it gratefully. I put it in the recycling. He sent another one the following week, as if the first hadn't landed. I started leaving them unopened after that, a small stack accumulating on the counter like evidence in a case neither of us wanted to try. I'm 66, not 90, I told him. Mum, you can't even manage the Wi-Fi password half the time, he said, which was true, and which also had nothing to do with anything, and I hated how much that sentence stayed with me. It was around then that I heard from Bayani Suarez. We'd worked together in billing for over a decade before he retired. Steady, unromantic man, always double-checking a claim 3 times before he'd sign off on it. He'd heard about Don through a mutual friend and sent me an email that started, "Sorry about Donald," which I noticed, because everyone in Peoria who'd known him for more than a passing acquaintance called him Don, and Bayani's use of the full name felt like a small courtesy extended to a man he hadn't actually known well, the kind of formal respect you offer a stranger's grief rather than a friend's. It struck me only later, rereading the email a third time, how much that small formality had told me about the man. Careful, precise, unwilling to presume. That kind of carefulness, I'd learn later, ran through everything he did, from the way he double-checked a claim to the way he never once raised his voice at anyone, myself included, not even on the hardest days. He then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned he and his wife Nita had been living outside Cebu City for 6 years now, and that his pension went further there than it ever had in Illinois. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Nita's sister ran a little sari-sari store not far from where he lived, and that he'd taken up fixing radios in his spare time, not because anyone needed him to, but because it turned out he still liked being the man people brought their broken things to. It made me wonder, uncomfortably, what I'd have to become the woman who fixed, out here, now that nobody in Peoria was bringing me anything at all. I read that line more than the others. I sat with it a long time, longer than a sentence about a hobby should have kept me. I wrote back mostly out of politeness. Then I read his reply twice. Then 3 times. I printed it out, actually, on the home office printer that still had Don's business cards loaded in the paper tray, and carried the page around the house with me for 2 days like it might evaporate if I set it down. He didn't sell it to me. That's what got me, actually. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He gave me real numbers. Rent, groceries, what a doctor's visit cost him out of pocket the one time he needed stitches. He said the humidity took some getting used to and the internet went out during storms and his knees didn't love the stairs in his building. Ordinary complaints. Somehow that made it more believable than if he'd told me it was paradise. I started looking things up at night, after the house had gone quiet, the way you look up something you're ashamed of wanting. Rental listings in a place called Talamban, north of Cebu City. Photos of small apartments with tile floors and ceiling fans. I compared the monthly cost against what Sunset Meadows wanted for a companion suite, and the numbers sat there on the screen refusing to make sense together. I could live for 4 months on what they wanted for one. I made a spreadsheet, because that's who I am, with columns for rent and groceries and a line item labelled simply unknown that I kept padding higher out of superstition. I looked at photographs of Talamban's covered market until I could have described the layout to a stranger. I watched a grainy video, filmed by someone's shaking phone, of a Jeepney ride through streets I couldn't place, and felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realised had been clenched for over a year. I must have watched that same 3-minute clip a dozen times. Not for the scenery so much as for the sound of it. Horns, voices, a radio playing something I didn't recognise. proof that an ordinary, unremarkable life was happening somewhere, and that I might be allowed to have one too. I didn't tell anyone. I requested a passport renewal online at 11 at night, my heart going like I was doing something illegal, and hid the confirmation email in a folder labelled insurance, which nobody would ever open voluntarily. I want to be honest and say I don't know exactly when maybe turned into I'm doing this. There wasn't a single morning I woke up decided. It was more like water finding a crack, slow, then suddenly all at once, and by the time I noticed the crack had become an opening, I was already halfway through it. I think it happened in pieces, but I know exactly when it became impossible to take back quietly, and that was a Tuesday, when Craig came by to drop off groceries I hadn't asked for and saw my laptop open to a page of one-way flights to Cebu. He didn't yell. He went very still, which with Craig is worse. What is this? It's a flight search, Craig. You're planning to move to the Philippines. I'm looking into it. Looking into it, he repeated, like the words tasted wrong. Mum, you don't know anyone there. You don't speak the language. Dad's debt isn't even fully settled yet, and you want to get on a plane too. What, start over? At 66? Bayani's there. And I did speak with a lawyer, if you'd like to know, about. You spoke with a lawyer and not with me. That one landed, and I let it land, because it was fair. I hadn't told him. I hadn't told Diane either, though I suspected she'd have been gentler about it and worse at defending me. You can't even manage the Wi-Fi password, Mum, he said again. He'd said some version of that sentence to me 3 times that year, and something in me, some old obedient thing, finally just refused to answer to it anymore. I managed 31 years of hospital billing, Craig. I can manage a router. That's not the same thing, and you know it. It's exactly the same thing. It's a system. Systems can be learned. He rubbed his face with both hands, the way his father used to when he was working up to saying something he'd regret. I can't lose you the way I lost him. Not like that. Not out of nowhere. He left angry. The door didn't slam, which somehow made it worse. He closed it with the careful, controlled quiet of a man who wanted me to know exactly how hard he was working, not to slam it. I sat there afterward shaking, and instead of calling to smooth it over, the way I would have a year earlier, I opened the browser again and bought the ticket. That night, before I could talk myself into waiting for his approval, I hadn't asked for in the first place. Once it was bought, I did the math on what was left, and there wasn't much. The house money was mostly gone to Don's debts and lawyers. What remained was thin enough to frighten me sober the next morning. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I used to reconcile accounts at work, and worked out that I was still short. Not by a lot, but enough that the trip itself would eat most of my cushion before I'd even found a place to live. I still had the ring. I hadn't worn it in over a year, if I'm honest. It sat in a dish on the dresser, and I'd walk past it every day and feel nothing in particular, which frightened me more than grief would have. Selling it wasn't a grand, symbolic gesture when I decided to do it. It was arithmetic. It was the only asset in that house that was entirely, unquestionably mine, untouched by probate, unclaimed by anyone's lawyer. I held it in my palm for a long minute before I put my coat on, turning it under the kitchen light, half expecting some final surge of feeling to arrive and stop me. It didn't arrive. I've turned that fact over more times than I can count since, trying to decide what it says about the marriage, or about me, and I still don't have a tidy answer. Diane once told me, long after all of this, that grief doesn't always arrive on schedule, and I think of that more than I probably should. I didn't cry at the counter. I keep circling back to that, because it bothers me more than the money does, more than the fear of what came after, more than any of it. A person is supposed to cry over a wedding ring. I know that. I've read enough magazine articles and watched enough movies to know exactly what that scene is supposed to look like, and I simply didn't perform it, not because I was being brave, but because there was nothing in me left to perform it with. Diane called the morning I left. Craig didn't. I sat in the airport with my suitcase, an old, hard-sided one of Don's, blue, with a wheel that stuck, and an empty seat beside me that nobody was going to fill, and I read a text from Craig that just said, "Call me when you land." Not "don't go," not "I'm scared for you," even though I think that's what he meant. Just an instruction, the last one he'd get to give me from a distance for a while. I sat there long enough that the boarding announcement caught me by surprise, and I gathered my things the way you gather yourself before walking into a room you know will be difficult, one item at a time, so as not to think too hard about the whole of it at once. I didn't answer it. I told myself I would once I landed, once I had good news to soften it with. 20-some hours later, jet-lagged in a way I hadn't experienced since I was young enough for jet lag to feel like an adventure, I climbed into a taxi at Mactan Cebu Airport and handed the driver a printed address for the apartment I'd found online. The one Marites Cabral had described in careful, slightly formal English over 3 email exchanges. The driver frowned at the paper, turned it over as if the answer might be on the back, and said something to me in Cebuano before switching, apologetically, to English. "Ma'am, this address. I don't think this is Talamban." I looked down at the paper in my hand, at an address I'd triple-checked from a kitchen table 4,000 miles and 1 cancelled marriage away, and felt, for the first time since the pawnshop counter, something that might actually have been fear. The driver ended up calling the number on my confirmation email, speaking rapid Cebuano into his phone while I sat in the back seat sweating through my blouse, and it turned out I'd transposed 2 numbers on the street address. Nothing more sinister than an old woman's tired typing at midnight. He laughed about it, not unkindly, and got me there within 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes had done something to me. I sat with my hands flat on my knees the way I used to sit in Don's car when he drove too fast, bracing for something. Cebu City came at me in pieces I hadn't expected. I'd read every article I could find about culture shock before I left, the 5 stages, the honeymoon period, all of it laid out like a syllabus, and none of it prepared me for how specific the disorientation would actually feel. Not fear exactly, more like being handed a script in a language I half recognized and asked to perform it live. The heat first. Not Augustine, Illinois heat, but something with weight to it, that pressed down the second the airport doors slid open. Then the noise. Jeepneys with their horns going like conversation, motorbikes threading between cars with an ease that looked reckless and turned out, over time, to be its own kind of precision. I gripped the door handle the entire ride, certain we were about to collide with something, and the driver glanced back at me once in the mirror with an expression somewhere between amusement and reassurance, as if to say this was simply how the road worked here, and I would either learn its rhythm or spend my whole time here frightened of it. Fluorescent light everywhere. It buzzed faintly overhead in a way that reminded me, unhelpfully, of the hospital break room I'd sat in 1,000 times over 31 years, waiting out shift changes with lukewarm coffee, and for one disorienting second I wasn't sure which country I was standing in at all. The smell of something frying, and diesel, and rain that hadn't fallen yet but was clearly coming. I sat in that taxi clutching my purse against my stomach like someone was going to reach through the window for it, which nobody did. A boy of maybe 10 sold garlands of white flowers at the stoplight, tapping on windows with a patience that suggested he'd long since stopped taking rejection personally, and I found myself wishing, absurdly, that I had pesos ready to buy one, just to have done something ordinary and generous in my first hour, instead of sitting there clutching my purse like a woman waiting to be robbed. The apartment building, when we finally found it, was a squat concrete thing with laundry strung across a few of the balconies and a small sari-sari store built into the ground floor, shelves of instant noodles and soda visible through the open front. It wasn't what the photos had promised, exactly. Smaller, plainer, the paint more tired. And for one long, humiliating minute I stood on the sidewalk with my suitcase convinced I'd been scammed. The rent had seemed too low. I did the currency conversion 3 separate times on 3 separate apps, certain I was making some elementary arithmetic mistake before accepting that the number really was that small, and that my entire understanding of what money could buy was about to be rewritten from the ground up. Everything I'd read online told me too low meant something was wrong, that someone was about to take my money and vanish. So when the woman came out from behind the store counter, wiping her hands on her apron, I did something I'm not proud of. I paid her the entire month up front, in cash I'd converted at the airport at a rate I hadn't thought to question, before she'd even shown me the unit, as if throwing money at the problem would somehow protect me from being cheated. She looked at the bills, then at me, with an expression I later learned was closer to amusement than gratitude. "Ma'am, you don't want to see it first?" Yes, of course, that was Marites Cabral. Mid-50s, direct in a way that startled me at first, because I'd spent 38 years married to a man who managed his displeasure through silence, and here was a woman who simply said what she thought. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that this wasn't rudeness, it was efficiency, a kind of respect that didn't waste my time pretending things were fine when they weren't, which was more than I could say for most of the conversations I'd had with my own husband. She counted the money back to me, minus the correct amount, told me plainly that I'd overpaid, and led me upstairs without much ceremony. Her English was careful and slightly formal, the way a person speaks a language they've drilled rather than absorbed, and I liked her immediately for not performing warmth she didn't feel yet, though I wouldn't have said that out loud at the time. I decided, standing in that stairwell, that she didn't like me. I spent the better part of that first week bracing for her to knock on my door with some complaint or another, rehearsing apologies for infractions I hadn't yet committed, the way I used to brace for Don's particular brand of quiet disapproval without ever quite being able to name what had caused it. It took weeks to understand that businesslike wasn't the same thing as cold. The apartment itself was small and clean, tile floors, a window unit air conditioner she assured me worked most of the time, a ceiling fan, a kitchenette I could stand in the middle of and touch both walls. It felt like downsizing in the cruelest possible way. Not because the space itself was unkind, but because every square foot of it seemed to be quietly asking me to account for what I'd actually needed, all those years, in a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement, compared to one room where I could hear my own breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed after Marites left and didn't cry, again, and found that troubling in a new way. Banking turned into its own small ordeal. Bayani had made it sound simple over email. Open an account, set up the transfer, done. But the reality involved 2 trips to different branches, a folder of documents I hadn't known I'd need, and a very patient young man behind a desk who kept explaining fee structures I nodded along to without fully understanding. I've spent 31 years being the person on the other side of that desk, the one explaining coverage and deductibles to confused, exhausted people, and I understood then, more sharply than I ever had while employed, exactly how much dignity it costs to nod along rather than admit you're lost. I wrote down what he said in a little notebook I'd started carrying, the way I used to note discrepancies in patient accounts at the hospital, though I suspected even then that I'd missed something in the fine print. I told myself I'd sort it out later. I didn't sort it out later. There was a maintenance fee I only discovered 3 statements in, buried in fine print, translated loosely enough that I couldn't have argued the point even if I'd wanted to, and a foreign transaction charge on top of it that ate more of my monthly budget than I liked to admit. I called the bank's hotline once to ask about it and sat on hold for 40 minutes listening to a looped recording of tropical-sounding music, which struck me, even irritated as I was, as a strange kind of fitting. I told myself it evened out. I wasn't entirely sure it did. It was Marites' daughter who made the difference in those first days, though I didn't recognize it as significant at the time. Christina, Tin, she told me to call her, was 24, studying nursing, working the sari-sari counter some afternoons when her mother needed the help. The second time I came down for bottled water, she remembered, without being told twice, that I took it warm rather than cold because of my teeth. Nobody had remembered a detail like that about me in longer than I wanted to think about. I stood there at the counter holding a lukewarm bottle of water and had to look away from her for a second, which she was polite enough not to comment on. After that, I started coming down more often than I strictly needed water, and neither of us pretended otherwise, though we also never quite said so directly. That's its own kind of honesty, I've decided. The kind that lives in habit rather than in words. Bayani and his wife Nita had me over that first week, to an apartment not so different from mine, 2 neighborhoods over. Nita made adobo and Bayani talked numbers the whole evening in the same flat, reassuring way he used to talk about insurance claims back at the hospital. Nothing dressed up, nothing sold to me. He told me about the retiree visa, the SERV, and how the deposit requirement had changed twice since he'd applied, how I'd need to get current information rather than trust anything he remembered. He told me healthcare here worked, but not the way I was used to, and that I'd want to find a doctor before I needed one, not after. Nita, halfway through her second glass of wine, told me flatly that the humidity would ruin any hairstyle I was attached to, and I laughed for the first time in longer than I could place. Bayani walked me out to the gate afterward and, almost as an afterthought, told me that the first 6 months had been the hardest of his retirement, harder even than the year he'd spent unemployed back in the States, and that nobody had warned him it would feel that way before it got easier. I appreciated him more for saying that than for anything reassuring he could have offered instead. Nita caught my eye across the table while he said it and gave me a small nod, the kind exchanged between people who've each separately survived the same unglamorous stretch of road. I went home that night lighter than I'd felt in over a year, and less than 48 hours later, Craig called and asked to see the apartment over video. I shouldn't have agreed. I know that now. But he asked in a tone that sounded almost like an olive branch, and I wanted to believe it was one, so I walked him around the little room with my phone held out at arm's length, narrating like a real estate agent trying too hard. "That's it?" he said, when the tour was over. "Mum, it looks bare. Where's your furniture?" "I didn't bring furniture. Craig, I brought a suitcase. I don't like this. I don't like that you're alone in a building I've never seen, in a country where I don't know a single person who could actually check on you. I have neighbours, Craig. I have a landlady downstairs and her daughter who's already taught me more about this city than any brochure ever did. That's not family. That's not the same as us, knowing you're okay." "Then come see for yourself," I said, before I'd fully thought it through, and regretted it immediately, and didn't take it back. "Bayani's people are. Bayani is a co-worker from 20 years ago. That's not the same as family." I didn't have a good answer to that one, and the silence stretched long enough that he filled it with something about the Wi-Fi connection cutting in and out, and we hung up shortly after, both of us unsatisfied. I sat afterward turning my bare ring finger with my thumb, an old habit I hadn't broken yet, and felt the whole bright week curdle a little at the edges. I needed something to do with my hands and my mornings that wasn't waiting for the next disapproving phone call, so when Tin mentioned, almost offhand, that she was struggling with an English composition assignment for one of her nursing courses, I offered to look at it. One page turned into a standing arrangement. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, her drafts and my red pen, in exchange for her walking me to the market the first few times, so I'd stop getting quoted the foreigner price for mangoes. It wasn't much. It felt like more than it was, which I understood even then was probably a sign of how little I'd had of that kind of usefulness in years. Tin's handwriting on the page corrections started to loosen after a few weeks, less cramped, more willing to risk a sentence that might be wrong, and I recognized that particular unclenching because I'd felt something like it myself, sitting in that same kitchen a month earlier, waiting to be told my ideas didn't matter, and slowly realizing nobody there was going to tell me that. I noticed the tuition envelope on the counter one Thursday. Maritése's handwriting on it, a balance circled twice, and Tin's face went tight when she saw me looking, and neither of us said anything about it. I filed it away the way I used to file discrepancies at work, a thing to come back to, not yet a thing to act on. I told myself it wasn't my business. I mostly believed that. The first month settled into something like a rhythm. I woke without an alarm, made 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. Though some mornings my hand still reached for the second mug before I caught myself, and walked to the little bakery 2 streets over for pain de sal while it was still warm enough to steam. I liked the woman who ran the counter. I liked the sound of the language around me, even when I couldn't follow it, the way you can like music in a language you don't speak. I started picking up words the way you pick up loose change, a few here and there without trying. Salamat, Ingat, Taranay, and saying them badly enough that Tin would laugh, kindly, and correct me, and I didn't mind being laughed at nearly as much as I would have a year earlier. I didn't, yet, feel entirely like a person who belonged there, but I no longer felt, every hour, like a person who had made a terrible mistake, either. If any of this sounds familiar, starting over later than you planned, or watching people who love you get scared instead of curious, I'd genuinely like to hear where you are in your own version of it. Leave a comment and tell me. And if you haven't already, hit like on this one. It helps more people find these stories than you'd think. That changed the last week of the month, when Maritése mentioned, wiping down her counter with more focus than the task required, that there was a storm being watched out in the Pacific, still days off, still uncertain, but that people were already talking about it at the market. She said it the way you'd mention rain in the forecast, not alarm, just information, and I nodded and thanked her and went back upstairs to check my phone, where I found 3 unread messages from Craig I hadn't gotten around to answering, and no idea yet how much that storm was about to cost me. The storm had a name by the time it mattered, and a track that kept shifting on the news graphics Maritése's husband watched on a small television propped behind the store counter. I didn't understand the terminology. Signal numbers, categories that meant something different here than the hurricane scales I half remembered from home. But I understood the tone in people's voices changing over 2 days, the way the market got busier, shelves of canned goods and candles thinning out. I bought too many candles and not enough matches. A mistake I only discovered once the power actually went, fumbling through a kitchen drawer in the dark for a lighter that turned out to be empty, laughing at myself alone in a way that would have alarmed anyone watching. Tin helped me fill jugs with water and tape an X across my one window, which felt dramatic until the wind started and I understood it wasn't. The power went first, late afternoon, And then the water pressure dropped to nothing sometime in the night, and I lay on that thin mattress in the dark, listening to something metal banging against the building outside, and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that if I died right there, it would be days before anyone in Illinois even knew to be worried. I want to say I panicked. I didn't. Not exactly. 31 years in hospital administration teaches you to function through a crisis even when your hands are shaking, and I found myself doing the same thing I used to do during a systems outage at work. Making a list, working the list, not looking too far past the next item on it. I thought, oddly, of a hospital-wide computer failure back in maybe 2009, how the whole billing floor had gone quiet and then loud and then quiet again as everyone found their footing, and how strange it was that the same steadiness would come in useful here, 4,000 miles and a lifetime away from that fluorescent-lit office. Candles rationed, water rationed, batteries rationed, though I only had 4 to begin with, 2 of them already half dead in a flashlight I hadn't tested since packing it. Check on the neighbours. I went down 2 flights in the dark the next morning to check on Maritise's family and found her husband, Boyette, on a ladder trying to secure a loose section of roofing that the wind had peeled back, and I found out exactly what, without fully deciding to, means when I watched him slip. It wasn't a bad fall, by the look of it, but his ankles swelled fast, and Maritise's face went the particular grey of someone doing arithmetic she didn't want to be doing. No clinic opened nearby that day. A tricycle driver willing to make the trip for triple the normal fare. Cash that I understood. Without being told, they didn't have easily to spare that week. I thought, standing there watching Maritise do the math in her head, of every time Don had made a financial decision without consulting me, and how different this felt. Not power over someone else's need, just the plain, uncomplicated relief of being able to do something useful with money I finally controlled myself. I paid the driver before I'd thought it through. I paid the small private clinic that was open, despite everything, in cash, and told Maritise it was nothing, don't mention it, and meant it in the moment, and didn't tell Craig, and didn't examine too closely why not telling him had become so automatic. Diane arrived 9 days later, in the middle of the cleanup, with a suitcase and an expression that told me before she said a word that this wasn't entirely her idea. "Craig asked me to come check on you," she admitted, over the instant coffee I made her that first morning, sitting on my one kitchen chair while she took the edge of the bed. "He didn't want to say that outright. He said I should just visit. And you're telling me because I don't like lying to you, Mum, even a little." I appreciated that more than I let on. Diane has always been the child who'd rather smooth things over than say the hard thing directly, and watching her choose honesty, even nervously, felt like its own small gift. She saw the storm damage still being cleared. The peeled roofing, a fallen mango tree 2 doors down, the water stains climbing the stairwell walls. And I watched her flinch at all of it the way I imagined Craig would have flinched, harder. But she also saw Boyette hobbling around on a wrapped ankle, cheerfully directing his son-in-law's cousin in propping the roofing back into place, and Tin bringing me a plate of food unasked because she'd noticed I hadn't eaten, and Bayani stopping by with a spare fan he no longer needed. She didn't say much about any of it out loud. I noticed her noticing, though, the way you notice someone doing arithmetic behind their eyes. That evening, she helped me sweep water out of the stairwell landing, sleeves rolled, saying very little, and at one point stopped mid-motion and said, almost to herself, "I didn't picture it like this," which I took to mean she'd pictured something worse, and also something entirely different, and that both of those pictures were quietly rearranging themselves in front of her. The tuition balance came due again while she was there, worse this time. Tin short by an amount that would have meant delaying her final semester, possibly losing her clinical placement. I sat with the number for 2 days before I did anything about it, turning it over the way I'd turned over Don's hidden debts after his funeral, trying to work out whether helping was generosity or foolishness, whether it was different from what he'd done to me or exactly the same shape wearing a kinder face. I told Diane. I don't fully know why her and not Craig, except that I knew what Craig would say before he said it, and I wasn't ready to hear it yet. "That's a lot of money, Mum," Diane said carefully. "It's not nothing. It's also not going to bankrupt me. Does Craig know?" "No, and I'd rather you not." She didn't promise. I noticed that too, later, and didn't think much of it at the time. He found out anyway, the way these things happen. A bank notification I hadn't thought to disable, forwarded automatically to an account he still technically had access to from managing things after Don died and never fully relinquished. He called 2 days after I'd wired the money, and his voice had a pitch to it I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in a lie. You sent $600 to a girl you've known for 6 weeks. I've known her longer than that, and it's tuition, Craig, it's not. This is exactly what happened with Dad. Exactly. Money moving around that nobody in the family knows about, and everybody finds out after the fact when it's already gone. That one hit harder than he could have known, because I'd had the same thought myself, alone, at 2 in the morning, and hearing it said back to me in his voice felt like being caught at something. I am not your father, I said, and my voice came out sharper than I intended. I'm not hiding this from you because I'm ashamed of it. I'm hiding it from you because I knew exactly this conversation was coming, and I am so tired, Craig, of asking permission to spend my own money. It's not about permission, it's about you getting taken advantage of. Maybe I'm not afraid of being taken advantage of, I said, and this part came out before I decided to say it. Maybe I'm afraid of being irrelevant, of nobody needing a single thing from me ever again except that I stay safe and quiet until I die. Neither of us had anything to say to that. We hung up without really finishing the argument, the way families do sometimes, each of us certain we'd been the reasonable one. I sat on the edge of the bed afterward with the fan doing nothing against the heat, replaying my own voice, saying the word irrelevant, surprised at how long it must have been sitting in me, waiting for a fight to shake it loose. The heat caught up with me 2 days after that call, during the worst of the post-storm cleanup, when I was helping haul debris from the stairwell longer than I should have, past the point my body was telling me to stop. I remember bending to pick up a broken chair and the world tilting sideways, and then very little else until I was in the back of Bayani's car, Tin's hand gripping mine, someone's voice. Maritis's, I think, saying my name too loudly, like volume might keep me conscious. Dr. Larad's Riaz's clinic was small and unglamorous and entirely competent. She didn't fuss over me as some poor foreign woman who'd overdone it. She checked my blood pressure, asked pointed questions about how much water I'd actually been drinking, told me plainly I was dehydrated and had likely been for days, and gave me a bag of fluids and instructions I actually listened to, because she delivered them the way a person delivers facts, not a warning. She asked, without any particular urgency, whether I had someone checking in on me regularly, and when I hesitated over the answer, she simply wrote something in my chart and moved on, the way a good nurse used to do back when I was the one standing behind the desk instead of sitting in front of it. I told her, eventually, about Marites and Tin, about the balcony and the coffee, and she nodded like it confirmed something she'd already suspected about people who end up fine. Marites sat with me the whole time. Tin held my purse and argued, in Cebuano I couldn't follow, with someone at the front desk about the bill, and I found out later she'd talked them down to a payment plan without asking me first, which should have annoyed me, and instead made me want to cry. Finally, 3 days too late for the ring, and right on time for this. Diane called Craig from the clinic waiting room. I heard her voice through the wall, low and steady in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. I thought, listening through that thin clinic wall, that I was hearing my daughter finally stop mediating and start deciding, and something in me settled to hear it, even lying there with an ive in my arm and sweat still cooling on the back of my neck. I'm not managing this for you anymore, Craig. She's fine. She's also not fine, in the way you're scared of, and you need to hear that from her, not from me pretending everything's okay so nobody has to be upset. He called an hour later, once I was back at the apartment, propped up with the fan aimed directly at me like a shrine. His voice had lost its edge, replaced with something quieter and worse. I'm coming out there, he said. I want to see it myself. Craig, you don't have to. I'm not asking, Mum. I'm telling you I'm coming. I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up, the fan humming, Maritis's voice drifting up faintly from the store below, and understood that whatever came next would either prove something or unmake it entirely, and that I had no way of controlling which. Craig landed 9 days later, and I met him at the airport the way you meet someone you love and are also slightly afraid of. Hovering near arrivals, rehearsing sentences I abandoned the second I saw his face. He hugged me first, which surprised me, hard and quick, and then held me back at arm's length to look at me the way he used to check a totaled car for damage. You look thin, he said. I look the same. You look like you didn't sleep on the flight. He didn't, as it turned out. He spent most of the ride from the airport with his forehead against the taxi window, watching the traffic weave in ways that clearly alarmed him, and I watched him watching it and said nothing, because I'd learned by then that some things you can't explain to a person, you can only let them sit in. He didn't soften at the apartment. I hadn't expected him to. He noted the size of it out loud, the single window unit, the stairwell water stains still faintly visible from the storm, and asked, more than once, what I'd do if I fell, if I got sick in the night, if the power went out for a week instead of 3 days. I answered the full question with more confidence than the others, because Marites had already walked me through exactly who to call and how fast a tricycle could get me to the clinic, a fact that seemed to unsettle him more than reassure him, as if the specificity of my answer only proved how seriously the danger had to be taken. Practical questions. Fair ones. I answered them as honestly as I could, which sometimes meant admitting I didn't have a perfect answer. Maretz came up to introduce herself properly the second morning, businesslike as ever, and I watched Craig try to read her the way he read insurance claimants, looking for the tell, the crack in the story. He didn't find one, because there wasn't one to find. Tin came by that afternoon with a folder of her coursework, thanked him for flying so far to check on his mother, and then, unprompted, told him plainly what our Tuesday and Thursday afternoons had actually meant to her. Not charity, she said, but the first person outside her family who'd read her work like it mattered, who corrected her sentences instead of just praising them. Craig listened to that with his arms crossed and his face doing very little, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. I showed him my serve paperwork that evening, spread out on the little kitchen table like a claims file, walked him through the deposit, the renewal terms, the budget I'd built and rebuilt twice since arriving. I showed him Dr. Riaz's card, the follow-up appointment already scheduled, the notebook where I'd started tracking my blood pressure the way she'd told me to. I wasn't performing competence for him. I was showing him the actual shape of my life, in case the shape itself was the argument. He asked sharp, careful questions the way he does with a claim he suspects is being overstated, and I answered each one without flinching, and somewhere around the third or fourth question, I watched the posture of the interrogation soften into something closer to genuine curiosity, which felt like its own small victory. At one point, he actually laughed, short and surprised, at a line item I'd labelled emergency mango money, and I let myself enjoy that small crack in his vigilance without remarking on it. The proof, when it came, wasn't anything I planned. On his third night there, a woman 2 floors down went into labour early, and the building erupted into the particular controlled chaos of people who've done this before. Someone running for a tricycle, someone else boiling water for no reason anyone could fully explain except that it felt useful, and Marites, mid-organising, turning to me by instinct and asking whether I remembered anything from my hospital years that might help while they waited for transport. I didn't deliver a baby that night. I did sit with the woman's frightened teenage sister, in English simple enough to be understood, telling her what was likely happening and why the waiting itself wasn't a bad sign. Because 31 years of billing had put me in enough hospital hallways to know how to talk someone down from panic, even when I wasn't the one holding the chart. Craig stood in the doorway the whole time, saying nothing, and I didn't notice until later how closely he'd been watching. Not the emergency, but me inside it. Steady, useful, not managed by anyone. We talked properly that last night, on 2 plastic chairs Maratis kept by the store for exactly this kind of conversation, the noise of the street settling into its evening rhythm around us. I wasn't scared you couldn't handle things, he said finally, staring at the street rather than at me. I was scared I'd get a call one day and you'd already be gone, and I wouldn't have done anything to stop it, the way I didn't do anything about Dad, because I didn't know there was anything to stop. You couldn't have stopped your father. Craig. I lived with him for 38 years and I didn't stop him. Did you love him? At the end? I hadn't expected the question, not from him, not that directly, and I found I didn't want to lie to him the way I'd been lying to myself for over a year. I was relieved when he died, I said. Before I was sad about it. I've never said that out loud to anyone, and I'm ashamed of it, and it's true. He didn't flinch, which I hadn't expected either. He just nodded slowly, like something had finally been filed in the right place. I'm not going to pretend I love the idea of you being this far away, he said, but I'm not going to keep managing your accounts either. I want a call every week, something normal, not a check-in. And if something's wrong, you tell me. You don't wait until Diane has to tell me for you. It wasn't approval, not exactly. It was something more honest than approval, and I took it. We sat a while longer without talking, which surprised me more than anything he'd said. Because silence between us had always meant something was wrong, and this particular silence didn't feel like that at all. Before he left, I sat down with Tin properly, the two of us and Marites at the kitchen table, and we worked out something clearer than the informal arrangement we'd drifted into. A set contribution toward her final semester, agreed in writing, not open-ended, not a rescue, just an arrangement between two people who decided they mattered to each other in a specific, bounded way. Marit signed it too, as a witness, and I noticed her hand shook slightly holding the pen, though whether from relief or pride or something else entirely, I didn't ask, and she didn't say. Tin cried a little. I didn't, which by then had stopped surprising me. The morning after Craig's flight left, I walked to a small jewellery stall near the market I'd passed a dozen times without really looking at, and bought myself a plain silver band. Nothing fancy, nothing meant to replace anything. I put it on my right hand. It felt strange for exactly one day, and then it didn't. I catch myself looking at it sometimes while I'm doing something else entirely. Washing a dish, counting change at the market, and feeling a small, private satisfaction that has nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of it, which is, I've come to understand the entire point. These mornings, I make 1 cup of coffee and I carry it out to the shared balcony above Marites' store, where Boyette's usually already out there fixing something that doesn't strictly need fixing, and a neighbour 2 doors down. Her name is Feli, and she has strong opinions about how I take my coffee that she's not shy about sharing. Calls my name across the railing before I've even sat down. Asks how my blood pressure's behaving, tells me about her granddaughter's exam results, whether I ask or not. I've started keeping a second folding chair up there for whoever wanders by, which nobody asked me to do, and which has somehow become the thing people expect of me now. The way Don's recliner used to be expected of him, except this one gets used. I still don't know, some days, if selling that ring was the bravest thing I've done or simply the last thing I had left to sell. I've stopped needing it to be one or the other. Some questions, I've decided, are meant to stay open. The way a window left cracked lets a room breathe even in weather you wouldn't choose to sit in. What I know is that I'd do it again, exactly the same way, with the same shaking hands and the same dry eyes at the counter. And knowing that, for me, has turned out to be a different thing entirely from being sure it was right. Some mornings I still catch my hand drifting toward where a second coffee cup used to sit in the old kitchen, muscle memory outlasting the house itself, and I let it happen now instead of correcting it, because I've decided grief doesn't need my permission to visit, only my honesty about what it's grieving. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for that. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for the next one, and tell me in the comments what you'd sell, or already have, to buy yourself a life that's actually yours.